Welcome to the Lady Landlords Podcast, where we empower women to gain financial freedom through real estate investing. I'm your host, Becky Nova, founder of Lady Landlords. If you're ready to buy, manage, and grow your real estate investing portfolio, then let's get started. Welcome back to today's episode of the Lady Landlords Podcast. I am your host, Becky Nova, and today we have a special guest, Adam Craig from CLE Real Estate Group, that's going to be talking all about some of the differences between using a property manager versus self-managing to help you make the right decision for yourself. So Adam, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
Hi, Becky. I'm really good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Of course. I always ask people just to kind of start off by just introducing who they are, who Adam is behind the real estate group.
Yeah. So I am a Cleveland native. I was actually born in Phoenix, but really grew up in Ohio. I moved here when I was 4. My family was originally from here. So I typically don't say I'm from Phoenix. It was a small segment of my life, but I'm 35 years old now. I've been real estate investing since 25. Ended up going to college at Kent State for finance. Thought I would be doing a financial advising, financial analyst job. And luckily, about senior year of college, after a lot of fails, I found an internet business for myself that kind of stuck. It was profitable. So I never ended up having to go into the actual workforce. I was able to work for myself right out of college. So I still do that internet business today. I won't go too much into it. It's not anything that wakes me up in the morning, but essentially it's online retail. I buy and sell youth electronics, mostly video cameras, digital cameras. The heyday of that company was probably about 7 or 8 years ago when I did over $1 million in revenue for 3 straight years. Since then, real estate has not only taken over my time, but that particular business has become crowded, which I somewhat anticipated. And luckily, I got real estate to the point where I don't need that business any longer. So I'll ride it till it dies, but real estate's where my passion is.
That's very cool. I love that you did all those things when you were so young as well. When you had that business that was wildly successful here on the internet with electronics, which is something that is so not like my space, what put real estate investing even on your radar?
I had a real estate bug at a young age. My mom actually started, I think it was Carlton Sheets way back when. She had the tapes when I was just a kid, and she bought a house outside of Cleveland. It was a crash and burn scenario. She knew nothing about it. She lost a lot of money, and that was the end of her real estate career. So I wouldn't say that inspired me to get into real estate, but at a young age, I realized that, hey, this is out there. It's out there. So it wasn't until maybe early in college, I decided I like to see the world and maybe get a corporate job, but working for myself is really my end goal. So I was fortunate to get the internet business up and going, but I wasn't foolish enough to realize that that was a forever business. Anytime you're in retail or just about any business, a lot of outside factors can crush that business. And for me, Amazon was 95% of my revenue. So Amazon held the keys to my castle. They could pull the plug at any given time among competition and a lot of other things. So I hustled very hard at that business, saved every penny I could, and I poured everything into real estate.
When was that heyday? How old were you? You said you got into real estate at 25. So was the internet business before that?
So I still remember the day I was in college. I was caddying at a golf course, making about $65 a bag. So maybe I'd make $90, wake up at 6 in the morning. I'd be home by 1, make, $80. But the internet business, it's buying and selling cameras, but not your newer cameras. These are older models, your high 8, your tape cameras, because people are actually buying these to transfer video. So for many, many years, I tried to sell the hottest, latest electronic gadget, and that space is crowded, but I was fortunate enough to find this niche product. So I'm sitting in my apartment. I had to go caddy the next morning, and I had just made, I think it was like $250, $300 on my internet business. And this had happened for consecutive days. So the next morning, I ended up shutting off my alarm, and that was the last time I ever considered caddying. That business did about $45,000 while I was in college in year number 1. And then by year number 2, it was approaching 6 figures. So I said, I'm not going to do this financial analyst thing. I'm going to try to see how this goes. And luckily it went really well for about 4, 5, 6 years. And I was making a lot of money right out of college. And I was about 23 years old when I started that business.
That's amazing. And then you said you got into real estate at 25. So was that buying a rental property? What does that mean, got into real estate at 25?
So at 23, I was making almost 6 figures, and I said, okay, this is time. Let's get into real estate. So naive me went to the mortgage bankers and they said, you're fresh out of college. You have 1 year of documented income. We can't do anything for you. So I hemmed and hawed about what to do for the longest time, just researched whether I'm going to buy a single family, a duplex, a house hack. Long story short, I ended up settling on just a single family rental. This is in 2013, so the deals were abundant. There was a property, a single family home that was on the market for well over a year. I ended up picking it up for roughly $45,000. It had a little bit of mold in the basement. Other than that, it was kind of a carpet and paint scenario, and that got me off and running.
You said you spent like a year kind of like researching and planning different kind of models, different types of properties. What had you land on the single family? Do you remember?
It was a lot of talking to property managers and more experienced people. And really what it came down to was maybe on a duplex or a threeplex or fourplex, your cash flow could be higher, but you have to run into things like turnover and more hands-on. And at the time, my internet business was my focus. So I wanted something that was going to be a little more passive. At the time, I actually thought I was going to be a passive real estate investor, hire a property manager, buy these houses, be hands off because my internet business was thriving. But, fast forward 10 years and it's a completely flipped scenario.
I was gonna say, I kind of want us to kind of skip to that future spot here, 10 years now in the future here. I kind of want to talk a little bit about what your portfolio looks like now. So then we can kind of go back and dive into the differences between working with property manager versus self-managing. So now 10 years later, what does your portfolio and what does your business and real estate look like?
Since 2013, I've done roughly 70 single family home, I would say rehabs, because they're all BRR strategy, the BRRRR strategy. Of those 70 plus homes, I still have 32 single family homes. But in 2019, I kind of pivoted toward commercial real estate. I haven't bought any residential since 2020. And now I own 9 commercial buildings in addition to the 32 single family. So roughly 40 properties with 80 some odd doors. And we've sold quite a few residential properties over the past 5 years as well.
Gotcha. I'm going to need you to define for our members here the BRRRR strategy. Can you talk us through that? Not all of our listeners are going to be familiar with that, and I'm sure they're starting to Google it, but let's just kind of go through what that looks like quickly.
Yeah. So BRRRR, buy, rehab, rent, refinance. And I didn't actually discover the strategy in 2013. I don't even think it was actually a designated strategy back then. It was kind of a philosophy. It wasn't like it is now. But
Right.
what I discovered was I bought my first 2 or 3 residential properties and my internet business was doing well, but I was flat broke. I had put 20% down to buy the property. I had to put all my money in to repair the property, and I was cash flowing a meager $200 to $300 a month. And I had $30,000 stuck in each property roughly. So I said, this is not a good way to scale. What am I going to do? Luckily, on my 4th property, I bought a real fixer upper, figured out how the whole BRRRR strategy worked, and I did nothing but BRRRR from there on out.
Is now real estate and running your portfolio what you do full time?
Yes, full time, every day, all day. I still have my internet business, but I devote less than 2 hours a day to that. With that said, the internet business is a fraction of what it used to be on the income, but it's a fraction of my time as well. So real estate has taken over on the income side and the time side.
Okay. And for a lot of our listeners, that really kind of is the dream, right? So when you first bought that first single family back in 2013, did you manage that yourself or did you automatically start with a property manager?
Started with a property manager. I never really went back and forth on that issue. I always thought property management was the way to go. I had spent, 40 to 50 hours a week on my business. I did not want to spend any additional time managing properties.
You said you just thought that was the way to go. Clearly, I understand that you had things that you were doing within your own business that were taking up your own time. But what made you say this was just clearly like no questions asked, no debate, the way that things needed to be done?
I think part of it was my illusion that it was extremely time intensive to manage properties, which it can be, but if you only have a handful, it's certainly not. So I always thought I'm going to spend my time where it's best suited growing my business. I'm going to hire the professionals to manage the real estate because I know very little about that back in 2013. So that was my thinking back then.
The first properties, was this near where you were residing?
Yeah, everything I own is probably within 40 minutes of where I live. This particular
Okay.
property was maybe 15 minutes from where I live.
It's the same thing. You're saying this is 15 minutes away, but I love that concept too. I think we need to do that more is to start outsourcing things when our energies could be best spent somewhere else, right? That's a topic that
100%.
I know a lot of our women run into. How helpful could it be to have somebody that can either help with some cooking, some cleaning, watching children, things like that, where then we can go out and say, well, if I can pay somebody $100 to clean my house for the hour, but yet then I can go and I can make more than that amount of money. Well, that's a better use of our time. That's a better use of our money, right? So I like that you were thinking really with that strategy. So how did you go about finding a property manager?
I mean, there's probably 5 times more property managers now than 2013 because I was just entering college during the the 2008 Great Recession. But that put a ton of people in the real estate business out of business. So there were as many
Mhm.
games in town, at least in the Cleveland market. So I just went with Referral, which is just a big broker in town that manages a lot of properties. And that's who I decided to go with.
Okay. I have to ask, did you do like a lot of research into that specific companies? Did you interview them? Or were you just kind of like, hey, this is the name I've seen the most amount of billboards. They're my people.
So I tried to find differences in fees, first of all. And when I realized the fees were all very similar, I spoke with a property manager who told me to shun away against the smaller property managers. He said they can actually run into solvency issues. And as soon as I heard that, I said, I don't want anything to do with that. I need to go with a big company that has their ducks in a row. So that's what I did.
Do you think in the end, and once again, I know we're talking to 10 years ago here. So if you don't remember, that's totally fine. But when you went with that bigger company, did you feel that then it became more of a decision based off of what the fees were, what the prices were? Or were you like, hey, this company seems like they are more popular, probably a little bit more organized, so I can sacrifice and pay a little bit more or have a couple extra fees to hope to have better service?
It was a little of both, probably split
Okay.
decision where I initially was all concerned about the fees. But then when I talked to some experienced people, they said, listen, you need to make sure you're not just going with the smallest outfit in town to save on the fees. In hindsight, I would have probably looked for a smaller outfit in town because I think smaller outfits can potentially manage your properties better. A bigger company, whether it's in real estate, in contracting, a lot of times they're spread a little thin.
Was this the company then that you ended up using for most of the time, if not all of the time, when you had a property manager in place?
Yep, they were the only company I've ever used. I used them for about 4 or 5 years.
Okay, gotcha. That helps. So, especially that now that you were working with them for such a long period of time, do you remember what some of like their fees were that maybe were a little bit surprising to you from what you would initially just thought about a property manager versus all of a sudden now hiring one, finding out like, wait, I didn't think we were getting charged for that, or I didn't think this was going to be a charge. Do you happen to remember any of those things?
Yeah, so it was a fairly standard fee. It was 10% of gross rents plus first month's rent. Half of the first month's rent goes to the broker, half of it goes to the listing agent, whoever listed the property. That's pretty standard, or at least it was back then. And at the time, I thought that was pretty good until I realized early on, you don't account for all the expenses. You kind of subtract your mortgage payment from the rent and you think that's your cash flow. And later on, you discover not only does vacancy go into that, but so many other factors go into sucking out your bottom line.
Right. So then now all of a sudden we're adding property manager. So was that something that when you bought that first property, did you factor in that 10% at that time or no?
I factored in the 10%. What I
Okay.
did not factor it in was the laziness of the property managers, how long the properties were going to sit vacant because of that laziness, and the reduced rent that I was actually getting because the property manager wanted to show the property and rent it quickly rather than get top dollar for me.
Feel like I'm sensing a little distaste in your voice.
Oh, it'll come through.
Okay, that's perfectly okay. And I want to kind of talk about that transition to self-management in a couple of minutes here. But walk me through. Now if we work with this property manager, the fact that you went with somebody larger, it sounds like they should have had within their paperwork, their contracts to not only for you put in place. Do you ever kind of going through that process? Was it just more of an email, hey, here you go, just go ahead and sign it? Or was it more like, hey, let's come to the office, let's go through these things, let's make sure everybody understands responsibilities? Or is it just like he signed, send it back?
They had systems in place in terms of their legal documents and signatures and contracts, but in terms of meeting and actually going over things in person, no, they were definitely trying to rush things out. And at the time, they were not the biggest property manager in Cleveland, but they soon grew to be one of the bigger ones. And I don't think they had enough employees to keep up with it.
What's interesting though is that you're saying that they kind of were rushing to clearly get you to sign as their client, but they didn't really seem to be hustling to get you a tenant. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. And, just like a general contracting business or a lot of businesses, when you meet the boss, it's great. But when you realize the boss isn't doing the work and his employees are actually doing your work and the employees aren't getting paid well, then it's not as great as it appeared to be when you signed the contract.
And not only that, but it's not just when you meet the owner, it's also sometimes with larger property management companies as well, when you meet the salesperson, because that's the person that can still make you feel really comfortable and really happy with the decision you're making. But once again, they're not the person that's out there actually selling your rental, right? That's a completely
Exactly.
different person. So
Exactly.
I can also see that there's kind of that swap between the person that you're actually the face that you're dealing with to make the decision as the owner of your real estate investments versus in the person that's actually doing the day to day management. So it sounds like things that we didn't like were the fact that they took too long to get tenants in. Was that something that was indicative of your work with them the whole time, or was that just on the first property?
So my displeasure started because I was doing the BRRRR strategy. So I was starting to get familiar with how much it costs to repair things. And I come from no construction background, barely can swing a hammer. So it was a steep learning curve. I was ripped off by countless contractors. Still am today. It happens. But I've learned a lot. I learned how much things cost. So when I realized that the property manager's maintenance team was fixing things at 2 or 3 times the cost that my maintenance team can do it for, we worked out an arrangement to the point where they were going to manage the properties and I was going to handle the maintenance. So we did that for quite a while. And I think it did save me money, but that was the first little spark that went off in my head that said, hey, maybe this property manager doesn't have my best interest at heart. I assumed they would have some kind of volume pricing and they would be getting these repairs done for a cheap discount, and they weren't.
Not like that, but usually then you kind of get that tacked on cost on the back end to saying, well, yes, it's the property management company now has to oversee the person on their team that's doing the maintenance, which then means usually there's a little extra fee on that as well, right? Because
Yes.
that's not always just included in the 10%. That's 10% just for the regular management. Now, if there's a problem or any other work that needs to be done, all of a sudden that's an additional cost. And once again, now when you're talking about how to analyze your property for cash flow, now you're not only just putting in what your factors are going to be for projected maintenance or for CapEx, but now you actually have to add on the property management fee for those items as well.
Yes. And I did consider some of these things in the beginning, but I didn't consider all of them together because we talked about the inflated expenses to get repairs done. And that was the first displeasure. The second displeasure led me to how long it took them to fill my units. And it wasn't until I self managed that I realized what a poor job they were doing.
Right. Until like you were really kind of able to take it over. When they were doing that, were you receiving like any updates on this? What was then your role? Now you have this property management company. The whole idea of why we use property management companies is for that whole set it and forget it. Somebody else is going to take care of the day to day. A lot of us investors are looking for more of that passive income, that mailbox money. And we think with property managers, this is just going to solve all of our problems. I'm just going to collect my rent check. It's going to be automatically deposited into my account. Don't have to do anything. Was that your experience? Or what role did you have in working with this management company?
So like you said, initially tried to be hands off, and it did take me long to discover that if you are hands off, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So if you are not in their gear, they will leave you alone and they will not do a good job. So it got to the point where I was following up. I had tenants contacting me directly, not sure how they got my information, but contacting me directly about unresolved maintenance requests. All the types of headaches that I would deal with if I was managing myself, somehow I was dealing with, even though I had a property manager. So it became evident that they were not managing very well and I had to make a change.
So we had maintenance not being followed up, clearly understanding prices of what they were charging just seemed a little bit higher than we kind of wanted here. We had then also them not helping you make money by not getting tenants in and not really, it sounds like having that precipice to really make sure that it was rented. Any other downsides or any other keys that you still have with working with that property management company?
Turnover was slow. Tenant would move out and it would take the property manager days, if not more than a week, to get over there. Sometimes the photos would be so bad that I would go over and take some photos myself because they didn't even have a professional photographer at the time. So the marketing was also terrible and slow.
It sounds like you really had to step in at this point, and you were, like you said, you're taking your own pictures, you're talking to the tenants directly, which is though a big no-no in what we were trying to do with property managers here. So it sounds like you really had to get like involved and be much more hands-on at this point in time.
Yes. And after I started handling my own maintenance requests, it didn't take me long to realize I was doing more than half the work of the property manager because maintenance requests are a biggie.
Yep.
And it was shortly after that I said, okay, we're going to transition some properties to me, some to you. Let's see how it goes. So
Okay. When you did that transition, some you'll leave with the property management and some you'll start transitioning to you and see how that goes. Do you remember about how many properties you had at that time in each of those buckets?
I want to say I started off with 3. I think I had 10 that they were managing, 10 or 12, and I started off with 3 of self-managing. And at the time, I was still giving them some of my new properties because I didn't think this was something that I still wanted to do full time at the time.
Right. Okay. That just helps to kind of see where that portfolio is. So my background's actually, I've worked in clinical research for decades. And so I always feel like whenever I'm testing something out new with my business, I always do my own little experiments on things. So that's why my brain automatically went to like, well, what was your control versus your experiment? Like what properties do you have on both sides? That
That's
was just
exactly what it was. Yeah.
right. I love that. I love that that was the way that you did that and really kind of went for proof of concept before taking that over. But I have to pause here. Was there anything that you liked about the property management company or having a PM in place?
So I learned a lot from having a large property management company. I took a lot of those things with me when I started self-managing, and a lot of it had to do with the legalities of just managing properties. Fair housing laws. I've learned about when you can evict. I learned 3-day notices. A lot of that, they had their systems in place. They had an attorney they can refer off of. So in the 4 or 5 years they managed, I started picking up on these things just through conversations with the property manager. So in that respect, some of the systems they had in place were good if they were ran properly.
Mikey Eastside has to ask this, but how did the experiment go? What were the findings that you found from taking over some of the management while leaving some with the property management company?
So I would say it only accelerated my rage against property management. I think one of the first properties I took over, we had been listing it for roughly $1,100. I put it on the market for $1,300, thinking it was a long shot. We got so many calls at $1,300. I had to say, what is going on here? Why did we have this listed at $1,100? So after talking to some people in the industry, I had anger towards property management because of this. But now, in hindsight, 10 years later, I don't have as much anger. I have an understanding. These property managers are not paid well unless they're the owner.
Mhm.
They typically are real estate agents that are just doing it on the side. They have way too many properties to keep up with. So you really can't blame them for doing poor service. If someone's motivated by money and they're not getting paid a lot, then they're not going to be too motivated. So it took me a while to discover that. And go back to the inflated rent. I was told, and it completely makes sense, that a property manager is making a portion of that first month's rent. To them, it's not a big deal if it's 1,200 or 1,100. That increase in their revenue is negligible. So they don't want to show the property 35 times. They want to show it once and be done. So that was my understanding as to why they listed it below market.
And then once again, for them, they just are trying to get people in faster, right? Even though that clearly wasn't working, once again, the way that they were doing it and probably because of their poor marketing. But to them, that was probably their strategy is let's just lowball rent, get people in faster.
It's misaligned incentives all over the place. They want to get people in faster, so they're not concerned about top dollar for rent. They
Mhm.
also get first month's rent on a new tenant, so they're not super concerned if that tenant lasts or if there's any turnover because their payday is first month's rent. Also, with my property management company, they were entitled to all the late fees, so they weren't really concerned about that tenant paying on time. So it was misaligned incentives all over the place.
Right. There's actually almost an incentive to have a lot of turnover so that way they can continue to kind of collect that first month's rent. So,
Exactly. Yeah.
gotcha. Okay. So now you start to take over a couple properties. What was that like now having control of that for you?
It made the maintenance requests a lot easier. And I realized, like I mentioned earlier, that the maintenance is probably more than half the work. After you get a tenant and there's no maintenance, sometimes it's easy street. You don't hear from them. You get your rent if it's a good tenant, and it's really simple. So it did make me realize again that the property manager was doing very little work to almost no work now that I'm self managing the repairs. And then that's when
Right.
I said, okay, we're going to have an end to this completely.
Were you also screening your tenants and placing tenants?
Yes, as best I
Okay.
could. Right now we have really good systems in place, but again, I did learn how the screening process works, so I did take some things from them.
What do you like best about being able to have self-managed for your properties?
Control. I'm a control freak. Even as I get busier, delegating is something I've done really, really well in the past few years, but I had a hard time giving things up, but pretty much my whole career. So control has been a thing.
Right. And that's for most people, right? These are usually large investments that we're making. This is a large chunk of money that we're putting into something and then really trusting that to somebody else. So I can absolutely see a lot of people being in that position where it's difficult to delegate in general in business, right? But now thinking about a large investment, an entire property that you're just handing over keys to somebody that you know very little about when you really think about it, right? I can absolutely see where there could be for some of our listeners too, just a little bit of fear or a little bit of nervousness with really kind of saying, hey, these are still things that I kind of want control of. We see that a lot in Lady Landlord. So I'm not surprised that that's still something that was kind of on your mind in that place. I think that's completely natural. Humans in general, we're not very good at delegating things out to others because people will never do things the same way that we would. And it's very difficult for us to kind of reconcile, well, they did it 60% as well as I would have. And I guess that's a winning score, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And huge hurdle to come over mentally because realizing what a poor job the property manager was doing really sets a bad precedent. You think if the property manager is not going to care about you, then really anyone you hire is not going to care. And to an extent, that's true. They do care at different levels, but no one is going to care as much as you do about your own business.
absolutely. Absolutely. And then once again, with a property management company or any other business, like they really have, everybody has their own interests at heart, right? Even the most like giving and understanding person can still understand that they need to, put their mask on first before helping others get oxygen, right?
And as a
So,
younger person that used to anger me as I would say older person, as middle, I'm 35 now. I understand. I understand more of where
right.
people are coming from. No one is going to be living for somebody else. Everyone's living for themselves, which is understandable. Like you said, some people are more selfless than others, but at the end of the day, people are put food on their table.
Correct. Absolutely. So with self-management, what was the piece that you found the hardest, that annoyed you the most, that you're like, this part, not my fave?
Think it was just getting our systems in place. When you start from scratch, everything from screening to accounting to, management, it's all difficult, but we did discover that, hey, there's tools out there that make this a lot easier. So we've been using property management software probably after a year getting into self-managing, and that really was a game changer.
So putting really systems in place, that was something. Before you had those systems in place, what were the things that you were like, oh, this is obnoxious. We need to find a better way to do it. We need a system for it.
I mean, turnover was bad because I didn't have contractors to the extent I had now. I was still, in the 11 or 12 years I've been in real estate, I've probably gone through 70 or 80 contractors to have the maybe 10 or
Wow.
so that I have now. So, having a tenant move out was always very daunting because I didn't know if I had an appropriate guy who can turn the unit over and who can do it at a good price. So that was probably my least favorite thing to do was get it released.
That's a lot of contractors you've worked with, talked to, interviewed. I have to almost take a little sidebar here. What are your top three things that you need to consider when finding the right contractor?
Top three. So, again, early on being naive, you think you're going to hire ABC contractor with a big name on his truck and the biggest game in town. And then you find out you're a landlord and you cannot afford to pay homeowner prices for repairs. So you are not using, well, at least I wasn't using the biggest game in town. Typically, I was using guys on Craigslist, guys on Facebook Marketplace. The guys that work for these big guys is who you want to find. With that, you deal with a lot of drugs and alcohol and theft and just about everything you can imagine. But it
Gotcha.
wasn't enough to turn me off from using those people. I just needed to find, I guess you would say, the diamonds in the rough. There's a lot of guys out there that are
Okay.
willing to work for less, but you need to find the right ones.
Okay. That's huge just because that's something that comes out with our group, especially being a women's group, dealing with contractors also kind of will add sometimes an extra level to that. So thank you for kind of that tip. I like that idea.
If I had to give one other tip, it just has to do with the down payment. I can't tell you how many times I gave a big down payment and he never came back. He didn't have enough money to finish the job, so on and so forth. So now I'm just so paranoid that if I meet a new contractor and he wants even a quarter down, I said, I will pay you every single day you're on the job site until we get familiar with each other. I'm not comfortable giving down payments to new people unless,
Right.
again, they have a reputation, which most of my guys did not.
Right. Right. Because once again, they're kind of people
Small
that
time.
the smaller time
Handyman,
kind of guys.
yes.
Okay. That's actually really interesting. We were having a huge debate about that in Lady Landlords yesterday with contractors always asking for that 50% down up front and what that looks like. So that's really interesting feedback. I'm going to have to make sure to link this episode in that debate that we were having yesterday in the group. So thank you
50%
for,
down causes a lot of problems. So many things can go wrong.
right. And a lot of stress for the person that's laying out that 50%. So thank you for entertaining my sidebar there. But literally, I just had that in my mind since we were talking about that all day yesterday. All right, back to property management. The two biggest questions I feel like that are always need to be weighed when talking about property management versus self-managing always comes back to, in my opinion, those two things being time and money, right? Thinking about time, do you now feel that there is such a crunch on your time from self-managing that property management really had alleviated that time issue when you had used them?
I would say it did alleviate some time for me. I was able to focus on my business, but it's all about your ROI. What are you willing to give
Right.
up for that management? So I would say your doctors and your business owners and people who want to invest passively, property management is still okay. And sometimes the only option if you're an out of state investor, but just be prepared to have a smaller return for all the reasons we discussed.
And then second factor would be money. So same kind of question here. Now knowing what you know about self-management, do you feel that that money that you were paying to the property manager was necessarily then worth that?
I don't. Maybe there would have been some other property managers that would have made me feel that way, but the one I had back then, I think they were not worth the money at all.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. No, as somebody that really has such a large portfolio and has kind of used both sides here, I'm really was intrigued to kind of hear your opinion and also why you now switched to that. But now, I mean, you have quite a few doors here with 80 doors. We're still self-managing those, correct?
Yes, about 86 stores, and me, my wife, and a couple part-time employees self-manage those.
Right. And then once again, you can kind of put together your own team and hopefully found really the right people that know you had control over to bring onto your team to be able to do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, my kids are 6 and 5 now, so this is the first time we've had both of them in school. So I didn't realize what a big role my wife was going to take on in the real estate. But had she not taken on that role, I would have had property management in house by just hiring a part time employee, and then I can the pay scale, and I don't have to pay by door, I don't have to pay by showing. So again, in house management is something I would have done, and essentially is what we are doing.
Right. I was gonna say that technically is still with your wife taking on that responsibility. So that makes perfect sense. My husband and I have a similar thing. He's has taken over really property management for our portfolio. So it's nice when you have a partner that is interested, has the time, has the care to be able to do it and the skills to be able to do it. There's always that's a whole nother episode talking about working with your partners. So that's a whole nother space. But with that, I'm sure some of our listeners hearing this right now are like, oh my God, self-managing like 86 places. A lot of them also invest by themselves. They do not have a partner that can be supportive. They're probably like, that's my entire day. I'm already working 40, 50 hours a week. A lot of our members have kids. That, is a 24/7 type gig here. Now they're probably hearing this being like, oh my God, like that's going to sound insane to have to still be able to manage that. Do you feel like the self-management of 86 stores is more than full-time, a full-time gig, or can be less than full-time?
I would definitely say it's part-time, and property management software has made that. So, I mean, I cannot imagine managing rentals in the 90s or 80s or the days before computers had taken over the
Yes.
management, but it had to be difficult. But yeah, now it's not always the best practice not to meet your tenants, but I haven't met hardly any of my tenants, which is great. And technology makes that a thing. So,
I do believe that to me also. I feel like with technology, that's been such a game changer. I agree. When people tell me that they go and pick up rented doors, right? Or I remember like my first apartment having to actually write a check and put in an envelope and mail it and actually have stamps. And I'm saying that being like, I can't believe that was the way that we really did things. I love being so much more on this side and being able to take advantage of all of that technology. My husband and I have 16 units across 2 countries, and it takes us 2 to 3 hours, like a month, to be able to manage those. And I'm like,
yeah.
this is fantastic. And honestly, I always tell people like my secret weapon is like literally this my phone. I can literally do that and manage my properties from anywhere in the world and in my favorite place, which is the beach. So I do.
And that's the thing. You might have to deal with some work while you're on the beach, but you're on the beach and it's a Tuesday. So,
Right. Oh, I've done rehabs from the Maldives and like those little like over the water huts. I remember I'll never forget this. It was actually during my honeymoon. We got a call from our contractor and he was like, hey, look at this. We got to show you what the bathroom is. And they'd installed the toilet. And he was so excited they installed this toilet. And he's like showing that to us. And he's like, well, why is it like just pitch black where you are? He's like, turn your camera on, because he couldn't see us. And I was sitting there and I'm like, no, no, our cameras are on. I'm like, it's 3 o'clock in the morning here. It's pitch black. There's no lights in the middle of the ocean. Like, that's why you can't see us. And we were just like, but thanks for calling to show us the toilet. So it was really nice just to be able to like FaceTime and check in and see what those updates were. But no, we've done rehabs from the Dominican Republic. We've done rehabs from the Maldives. We've done rehabs from Mexico, all back for our properties in New York. And honestly, I couldn't imagine doing that without something like technology. But it really allows kind of having that oversight that's still needed and making us feel safe and comfortable about these big investments. But having where I don't have to pay somebody 10, 12% to be able to do that themselves. So,
of everything else. Yes. And I don't know what you would have done in the 80s. What he sent you Kodak pictures of the toilet. I mean, I'm not sure how you would get by scaling without that technology. It would be much more difficult.
right. It really has made real estate investing just so much easier. And really, when we put those right systems in place, it allows us to really keep our time at a minimum and honestly also our costs at a minimum.
Yes.
Well, Adam, thank you very much. This has been very helpful. Thank you for walking through your experience using both property managers and self managing all of your properties. But thank you very much for being on the show. I greatly appreciate you coming on today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I do appreciate it.
For all of our listeners out there, do make sure to hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next episode of the Lady Landlords podcast. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please do make sure to leave us a 5-star review. This will help other future lady landlords out there find our community and come and be supported by all of us. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll see you all back in the Lady Landlords Facebook group. Thank you for listening to the Lady Landlords podcast. If you're feeling stuck in your real estate investing journey, visit lady-landlords.com to book a 15-minute orientation call with me and see if you're ready to join our mentorship program. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter and join our Facebook group for exclusive real estate investing tips and offers. Invest with confidence. Become a Lady Landlord today.